Chess has been described as the game of kings. And despite its somewhat mysterious origins and rich history of epic chess masters and epic chess matches, the rules are fairly easy to learn. Pawns can move only forward. Bishops can move diagonally. Knights can move only in an L shape. Rooks can move as far as they want, but can only do so forward and backward and side to side. Kings are extremely limited in their movement. And queens, well, queens have the most flexibility and power of them all. Yet the game, most likely invented in India over 1300 years ago, is almost infinite in its variations of play, and can take the average person years, if not decades, to master. Yet, where did all these rules come from? And why is the objective to capture the relatively weak king instead of the nearly all-powerful queen? Was this to prove a particular political point, as if the real power of a kingdom belonged to the women, even though the men were apparently the ones in charge? Or is the point of the game the playing itself, where the real challenge comes from the sudden realization that memorizing the rules is not the same as developing a strategy? Today, in part 3 of our video series, we will begin to explore how the deceptively easy ideas of the parts of speech can get lost amid the complexity of the eventual relationships that they form, once they are positioned on our language game board. We definitely won't become language masters at the end of this video, but hopefully we'll be better at learning the rules. Welcome to An Introduction to Grammar. In our last video, we compared the parts of speech and grammar to the ideas of puzzle pieces. We can often see the whole idea of language without knowing completely how it all fits together. Only certain puzzle pieces, which we refer to as the parts of speech, can go together in certain ways, which we're generally referring to as the rules of interaction. And of course, in only certain places, which is we refer to as location. And we also learned that these ideas can contain even smaller pieces that can help in identifying their place in the puzzle of language, which we refer to as suffixes. This week, we're going to explore the minor parts of speech and the roles they play in English, especially prepositions. We'll learn more about the major parts of speech, including how nouns and verbs can interact, and discuss the flexibility of adverbs. And we will also begin the transition from focusing on individual parts of speech to more complex forms of grammatical interaction. So again, the major parts of speech have been the focus of the last 2 videos we've talked about. And we focused on these ideas and referred to them as content words. This week, we're going to discuss the other parts of speech that, while significant, do play a different role in language, and we refer to these as the minor parts of speech. The major parts of speech, as we identified, are the words that contain meaning usually just by themselves. So nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs comprise the major parts of speech. And these words often interact with each other, and are often essential to determine the grammatical completeness of a sentence. And this will be an idea we will continue to explore in the next couple of videos. The minor parts of speech, on the other hand, are the words that kind of help provide structure to the overall sentence. And again, what they do is largely interact with the major parts of speech as well. The 2 we're going to discuss here in this video are articles and prepositions. These words need the other parts of speech to exist, and while these are important, they often play only a small role in the overall meaning of a sentence. The first idea we're going to look at involve articles. Now, from our article profile, you will see that on the left side, the form of articles are actually few, and we can generally divide them into two categories: indefinite articles and definite articles. Indefinite articles are those that help indicate a general idea that is unknown to us. So we're just referring to kind of a general quality of something. So, for example, in countable nouns, we would use this idea to, for the singular form, say, for example, a book. And the plural form, we might say some books, in which we don't know exactly how many books we have. In the definite form can exist both in the countable and uncountable state, and can be used in the singular and plural the same way, which is the word the. So, for example, if I say the book or the books, we know that we're referring to a specific idea that we can recognize. Over on the right side of the screen, indicating their function, generally articles have one function only, and that's to indicate a noun. Now, articles can be separated, and we will see that work in just a moment. Certainly, we have learned in the previous video that when we use adjectives to directly describe a noun, they usually go right before the noun. So in this case, they can separate an article from the noun it's describing. And the rule and limitation we can focus on is that they do work with nouns exclusively. Their use, on the other hand, will be determined by the type of noun we're using. And don't be surprised because some nouns don't need articles at all. Now let's use the sentence that we have been working with for the last couple of sentences. And of course, notice I've simplified it a little bit. So we have an article and noun relationship, and I'm going to use green to indicate the articles and red to indicate the nouns. So articles indicate whether the noun is something known to the speaker or writer of the sentence. So in our example, notice that the two animals are not just any fox or dog, they are the only fox and dog present. Now, this doesn't mean necessarily they're the only only animals. Now, watch what happens, though, when we add adjectives. So again, if we go back to our original sentence where we add the adjectives, we can separate the adjective from the article and say the brown fox or the lazy dog. So by adding adjectives, we've now created a much more specific context. So they aren't just any dog or fox or dog present, so they're not the fox and the dog, but now we see that they're the brown fox and the lazy dog. And let's look at this difference visually. So on the left side, I have a situation where I've just used the article and the noun. So the fox jumped over the dog. Now there might be other animals present. So for example, I've got a rabbit, and a duck, and a chicken here, a rooster. But notice that the fox and the dog are the only fox and dog present. On the right side, notice what happens when I qualified with the words brown and lazy. There could be other foxes and dogs present, but they're going to be different from the fox and dog we're talking about. So for example, you might notice I have a gray fox, and I have a dog here that doesn't seem so lazy. Of course, I might have other animals in the background as well. So in this case, I'm specifying that it's a brown fox and lazy dog from among the other animals and possibly foxes and dogs that are also present. So the use of the word the indicates a specific or definite idea, depending on the context. Now watch what happens when we change it to a singular indefinite idea. So now we have a brown fox and a lazy dog. Now the animals are somewhat unknown to us. In other words, these could be any fox and dog with no specific context. There might be other animals present, including other brown foxes and lazy dogs. So again, notice in this situation, we could have other foxes and dogs, other animals as well. But if I just say a brown fox jumps over a lazy dog, I'm not referring to any specific fox or dog. It just happens that this particular one is doing the jumping. So again, notice there are other foxes and dogs, but they're not jumping. This is just any fox and any dog. Of course, we could also use the context if we just happen to notice that there's a fox and a dog present. So notice this person sees a fox and a dog. Not any specific fox and dog, but just happens to be noticing at the moment when it jumps that this is a brown fox jumping over a lazy dog. So there could be lots of other things going on, or perhaps this is the only thing, but it's of no particular interest and doesn't exactly have a specific idea to the person who's watching. So for more information and practice about articles, you can visit the Grammar Resources link from our class website. So we've identified the articles in the sentence, and they're definite articles. And with our other color schemes, you notice we've identified all of the other parts of speech. And yet there still seems to be one word that we've not identified, and that's the word over. Well, in this case, this is referred to as a preposition. And prepositions in general link nouns together in a sentence, but we'll talk specifically how they do that in just a moment. Let's look at just a couple of different examples before we build a profile. So for example, notice the students here. Many of the students are walking to the school. So to in this case is linking the idea of students and school. It indicates their direction. They're heading to the school. Okay, in this picture we have two possible prepositions. We have children getting off the bus, and perhaps they're leaving from school. So in this case, we could simply define prepositions as something that anywhere a noun can go. A noun can go to school, a noun can get off the bus, and a noun can come from school. Now this is a fairly general description, but this will be enough to get us started. So let's look at our profile of a preposition. And again, first off, notice that the form of a preposition, there are way too many to list, just like there are too many nouns and verbs and so on. But prepositions are very specific. They tend to be these very little words, these small words, that are often very difficult for students to learn, especially from one language to another. But here are several examples that you see here: to, in, from, of, for, over, on, behind, before, and so on. And prepositions can indicate many things, not just location and direction, but they can also help indicate the time and the purpose and the reason of something. Over on the right side, talking about their function, prepositions must work with nouns. So you notice that prepositions generally at least have a noun that follow them. We also use prepositions after certain action verbs. These are called phrasal verbs, and we'll talk more about this in part 2 of this video series. So, for example, one phrasal verb would be the example of pick up. We can also use prepositions after a state of being verb to generally indicate the location of something. So if I wanted to give a simple sentence and say the book is on the table, I'm using the verb there as a state of being verb to indicate its particular location. So book is on. Of course, the rule that we just mentioned is that prepositions always need a noun to follow it, because that's their purpose, is to link nouns together. So whether the noun is directly stated or implied, prepositions always need a noun to follow them. So in this case, we've successfully identified our final word, the word over. Now, we're going to look at the sentence in a different way now. Now that we've identified every individual part of speech, we're going to lay out all of the ideas in one long string, starting with the beginning of the sentence, all the way to the end with the word quickly. But the problem is, we've been spending the last few videos talking about the relationships these words have together. If you notice, you can have some general idea of the location of words, but it doesn't help us very much in focusing on those relationships we've been talking about. So in fact, if you think about it, they kind of look a lot like those chess pieces we see on a board. They're just waiting to do something. The problem is, we know that each piece is different. We know that a noun and a verb and an adjective, they're all different, but perhaps it's difficult to remember, what does each piece do? Again, remember those simple moves we saw at the beginning of this video? We kind of have a basic idea what the moves are, but sometimes it's hard to remember what all of them can do once we put them all together. So we're going to start with prepositions, and we're going to see if we can't simplify this process to make it a little bit easier for us to understand. So let's go back and remember, again, kind of the basic move of a preposition, and that is the fact that prepositions always need nouns to follow them. So what I want you to think about this is what we might call a bound relationship. Bound means to kind of stick together. So in this case, think about it like this. Prepositions couldn't really exist unless they had a noun to link to. So since the preposition needs the noun dog, wouldn't it be just as easy to consider these ideas linked together? Why not just consider them one whole idea instead of just some individual words? So, of course, we also need to consider the article and the adjective. You see, they're part of this idea too. If you notice, they're between the preposition and the noun. So in this case, the article and the adjective, they're also bound relationships because they also exist solely to modify or to indicate the noun. So let's consider them one group or idea as well. So, since these ideas go along with a noun, then we can include these with the original preposition plus the noun relationship as well. So this brings us to the idea of what we're going to call a prepositional phrase. So, since prepositions always need a noun, this will help define the beginning and ending of this group of words. This is what we call a phrase. A phrase is defined as a group of words that have some relationship together with a specific beginning and ending. So what I want us to think about for a moment is we're going to use kind of a substitute. Instead of referring to this specific relationship as a preposition plus a noun, let's call it a prepositional phrase. So notice, we're going to rename, and notice I've put some parentheses around the idea. We're going to rename this idea a prepositional phrase. So watch what happens to our string. It does simplify things a little bit, doesn't it? Now, of course, this isn't the only phrase in the sentence. If you remember before, we talked about the article plus the adjective plus the noun group. So watch what happens there. So first we kind of identify the group. I use parentheses just to help identify them very quickly. And then we simplify that as well, and it becomes what we call a noun phrase. Now we call it a noun phrase, even though there's an article and an adjective, clearly the noun is the idea that's driving this idea. Noun is kind of the main thing here. So it's going to contain the noun and all of the ideas that are bound to go with it. So phrases, if you think about it, phrases are defined by the particular relationships that exist already in language, including words and ideas that are more or less bound together. And these phrases, if you've noticed so far, almost always contain at least one major part of speech or content word. So I want you to think of these phrases in a way as kind of helpful shortcuts, and they're helpful in identifying these grammatical relationships. Now, are there other phrases in our example? Well, certainly we're going to discuss more as we go along in this video series. But I do want you to notice for a moment the verb. Think about the verb. It's kind of left by itself. But we know that it must have relationships somewhere. As we stated in the very first video of this entire video series, every word has at least one relationship in the sentence. So if we go back to our verb profile, you will notice the very first idea is that a verb's whole purpose is to provide the action of a sentence, which means that it must work with a noun in some specific way. And again, notice we said the same thing with nouns. Nouns also, as one of their possible functions, work with verbs. So in this case, I want you to think of it as nouns are sort of like the key piece, kind of like the key piece on a chessboard. By comparing the two profiles, we notice that verbs and nouns seem to be essential to each other's existence. In fact, nouns are going to be the key piece to understanding how all of the other pieces in our sentence move. So, what I want us to do next is to think about nouns in a different way. You see, we started with nouns in a basic description, but today we're going to redefine them. So if you notice, nouns do seem to interact with many of the other ideas we've talked about in language. Adjectives, prepositions, articles, verbs. So it might seem now like a good idea to explore these relationships to help group them and understand them in a new way. So nouns, in order to think about it this way, nouns have basically 3 different relationships in language. And from now on, we are going to refer to them by these relationships, rather than just calling them nouns, for reasons that will hopefully become clear. Maybe not now, but hopefully in the next video. So, this particular next set of slides, I do want you to study them very carefully, because this is going to lay out a very important piece for us in understanding how nouns relate to other words in a sentence. So here we go. Number 1. Nouns must work with verbs to become what we're going to call the subject of the verb. And again, the verb is referring to the main action or state of being idea in the sentence. The next relationship is that nouns can receive the action of verbs, and we're going to call that relationship the object of the verb. And then please note, not every verb is going to need an object to receive its action. And we'll talk more about this in video part 2. And number 3, an idea we've already talked about so far, is when prepositions are present. In other words, when we have a preposition in a sentence, we must have a noun to follow it. So we're going to call this noun the object of the prepositional phrase. So please study these 3 relationships, and this slide will be posted at the bottom of the screen, bottom of the page, so that you can study this more in detail. So, the first noun, fox, is working the verb here to create the main action of the sentence. So it's the fox that's jumping. It's not the dog that's jumping, it's the fox. Now we know this because it's located directly in front of the verb. So for the time being, we're going to call this the subject of the sentence. So this is the subject that's going to work together with the verb jumped. And remember, every sentence must have a subject, which means it also must have a verb. So think again, this is what we call another bound relationship. You can't have a verb without a subject. Of course, you're thinking, wait a minute, doesn't fox already have a relationship? Isn't it already part of the noun phrase before it? Well, remember, that noun phrase essentially belongs to the noun in the group. Well, the noun in this case is the fox, and the fox is the subject of the verb, jumped. So, since we are no longer going to use these individual parts of speech designation, so we're not going to call it a noun anymore, let's redefine the idea in terms of the noun's relationship, which is, in this case, its essential relationship is to be the subject of the verb. So watch what happens. You see, now we're going to redefine the idea as a subject phrase. So instead of calling it a noun phrase, we've now redefined it as a subject phrase. The subject, again, is basically the noun that works with the verb in the sentence. So, of course, any articles or adjectives that describe the subject are in essence part of the subject idea as well. So we're just going to rename the phrase noun phrase and call it a subject phrase. Now you will notice though that some textbooks might refer to the actual subject, which in this case the actual subject is fox, and might refer to it as the simple subject. That's to help distinguish it from those other grammatical ideas, the article and the adjective. So again, notice what we're going to do with our noun profile. We're now going to change the profile to make it a little bit more specific. So in this case, instead of just saying nouns work with verbs, we're going to say that it can be the subject of a verb. Of course, we have to understand, and this is something we're going to talk about more in part 2, is that in order to be the subject, it must relate to the verb in some specific way. And we're going to refer to that idea as agreement. And it will agree with verbs in either a singular or plural form. And again, we'll talk more about that in part 2. So now let's go back to our prepositional phrase. Now we can redefine that by looking at rule number 3. So instead of calling the noun phrase the lazy dog as part of the prepositional phrase itself, we're going to redefine that as well. Of course, we're still going to call all of this the prepositional phrase because it does begin with the preposition. But watch what happens. The noun phrase, which is the lazy dog, we're now going to redefine as the object phrase. But the object phrase is still part of the overall prepositional phrase. So if you notice here, we didn't change the designation at all. Now, this object phrase is inside of the prepositional phrase. And in grammar, we call that embedding. Embedding means to put something inside of something. So, again, having phrases inside of other phrases, this is very common in grammar. Because remember, words are going to have more than one relationship. Many words are going to have more than one relationship. Some have only one, but some will have more than others. So again, remember, the noun dog is part of the noun phrase, the lazy dog. But the noun phrase itself, the lazy dog, is also part of the prepositional phrase. So again, by redefining it as the object phrase, basically we're indicating that the lazy dog is the object of the preposition over. So what have we learned so far? Well, we've learned that nouns and noun phrases, which are nouns in any of the words that indicate or modify nouns, such as articles and adjectives, can serve as the subject of a verb, the object of a verb, which again we'll talk more about in the next video, and the object of a preposition. We've also learned that each sentence must have at least one subject and verb relationship. Because each is essential to each other's existence, we must have at least one of them to satisfy that particular requirement. So now notice we've changed the noun profile again. We've added the three relationships under the function of the noun, and this is helping us to get to a more specific understanding of what nouns can be. So again, let's review them. Nouns can be the subject of a verb. They can be the object of a verb in which the noun would follow the verb. And again, we'll talk more about that in the next video. And that nouns can be the object of a preposition, which means they'll follow the preposition. Now, of course, adjectives can still modify nouns. So in this case, what I want you to think about is that wherever we can find a noun, which again, we can find a noun in these three situations, you might also find an adjective. And of course, you might also find an article, too. Now we're going to change the verb profile a little bit. Again, verbs, as we said before, they need a subject. And then sometimes they're going to need an object, sometimes not. And again, next video we'll talk about a little more in depth about transitive and intransitive verbs. And as we said before, the rule or limitation to think about is now a sentence must contain at least a subject and a verb. We must have at least one verb and a noun to agree with it in order to have sort of a complete idea. So again, in video 2, we will talk more about objects, transitive and intransitive verbs. So in part 2, we will explore the final noun relationship, object of verbs. And we will explore more about verbs too, and the phrases that they can create. And then we will also discuss the flexibility of the adverb and the possible phrases it can create and be a part of. See you next time for part 2 of Learning the Moves. Thanks for watching.